All right, Kayleigh, I'm so excited that you are here. Welcome to the Misconceptions podcast. This is really like the earliest versions of this launch of this new podcast, and I'm so excited that you've agreed to be one of my first interviews. Thank you so much.
Of course. Oh, I'm so honored. That's amazing. I'm really excited for you to get all this amazing knowledge that you have out there
Thank
in this
you.
format. Yeah.
Thank you. When I heard you present at a recent PSI presentation, PSI conference in Reading, Pennsylvania, it was the first time I heard. It was actually kind of funny. I don't know if you remember, but I went, "Oh, wait a minute, I know who you are." It was like a little bit of fangirl for a minute, where I was like, "I follow her on Instagram."
Yeah.
Tell me about your. I would love to start with your current Instagram presence. Like, who are you on Instagram? And then we're going to back it up and tell me who you really are in person.
Yeah. So my Instagram community is called the Birth Trauma Mama. And I started it back in 2020, January of 2020, in reaction to my birth experience and just feeling like perinatal trauma, birth trauma is not something that was openly talked about at the time, at least not in the spaces that I was navigating. I don't want to discount anyone who was talking about it at the time, but it was definitely something that wasn't publicly available for consumption outside of like therapeutic clinical communities. And so that is when I decided to start just sharing my story and seeing like, I just felt like I couldn't be the only one. I can't be the
Right.
only one having these feelings and experiences. And so, yeah, it was about 3.5 years ago now that I built that community on Instagram.
Wow. How do you define trauma for the purpose of this conversation?
Yeah, I think trauma is a subjective experience. So anything that really overwhelms someone's ability to cope, anything that, and we're talking, of course, in the birth and perinatal space, reproductive trauma, and so anything that occurs in that trying to conceive, pregnancy, postpartum um, arena. And again, anything that really is distressing and overwhelms that person's ability to cope. And that's going to look and feel different for each person. And that's why it is subjective. It's going to depend on a lot of factors like what their past experiences have been like, how they interact with the people in the room, how safe they feel both emotionally and physically. Could go on for days about the different
Sure.
factors, but
Sure.
just subjective experience. And therefore, no one can tell you whether your experience was traumatic or not. And something that was experienced as traumatic for me may not have been experienced as traumatic by someone else, and vice versa.
Absolutely. And you are yourself a therapist as well,
I
correct?
am, yes. I'm a
And
licensed clinical
were
social
you
worker.
like a clinical social worker? Yay, social
Yeah.
workers. And were
Yes.
you a therapist before you had your birth experience?
I was,
Okay.
yes. I was a therapist. I was working with adolescents and teenagers at a boarding school.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yes,
Different
yes,
kinds of experiences, but probably that similar thread of like traumatic histories and things that you've lived through and lived experiences.
absolutely, yes.
Okay. So I'd love to come back to that, what it means to be a therapist in the aftermath of a traumatic birth and the seriousness of like knowing what you're going through, but also being the person that is the one who's also needs to survive it. So I can imagine that has
Yeah.
a lot there.
Yeah, there was a lot there because I
Okay.
think in some ways it of course gave me a few advantages. The main advantage being that a week after I was discharged from the ICU, I was in an appointment with a perinatal therapist who
Mm,
specializes in this, because I knew that I would need support and I knew where to get it and how to get it. And I am privileged to have supports to be able to drive 45 minutes to and from to be able to go to the postpartum stress center in Radnor, Pennsylvania. And so those were a lot of things that I would say were in my corner. The things that surprised me the most were how unable I was to navigate the feelings that I was experiencing,
mm,
how unable I was to give myself a break and to give myself some grace.
mm.
So I survived an amniotic fluid embolism, which has a very high mortality rate and is very rare. And so my hospital had never seen one before.
Mhm.
And so it was this very big deal that I survived, and I survived neurologically intact, and my baby survived and did really well. Um, and so it was a lot of celebrating. It was a
Right.
lot of like, look how amazing this is. And
Right.
we cannot believe you survived, and over and over and over again.
Right. Right.
And
So
so, yeah, go
yeah,
ahead.
I want to come back to that because I feel like that I would like to start with more like what
Yeah.
happened. So for somebody
Yeah,
who
sure.
doesn't have any idea, what is a pulmonary embolism, right? What is a an amniotic embolism? What
Yep.
happened to you? You went in, everything was fine. You were giving birth to
Yeah.
your baby. Like tell me a little bit about what led up to those moments and as much or as little that you'd like to share, obviously, I'd like to for you to be able to tell your story.
Of course. So I love that you brought up pulmonary embolism. That is really important because a pulmonary embolism and an amniotic fluid embolism are two completely different things that actually have very little to do with one another.
Mhm.
And I experienced an amniotic fluid embolism, and it's pretty much misnamed at this point. It is not an embolic event in the sense that a pulmonary embolism is. So there is no obstruction really that is causing this full event. It is what we refer to as an immune response. It's most like an anaphylactic reaction, although it is not an anaphylactic reaction, but it is an immune reaction to amniotic fluid and fetal cells that get into maternal circulation. Now, that happens in most births, actually, but a small, tiny percentage of us, for some reason that we still don't know, have this massive immune response to it. And so when I went in to have my son, I had an induction because I had some gestational hypertension. I had some high blood pressures. I was given the option to go home or to have an induction. I was very worried about him being a big baby. He was. And so I went through with the induction, and I was 10 centimeters, again, healthy, pregnant person leading up to this point. And when I was at 10 centimeters, I turned to my nurse and I said, I'm not feeling well. And she said, okay, that's normal for transition. Let me get you a bag to be sick in. And I said, no, something's wrong. And she went to go look at my monitors and my vitals to check in on them. And as she turned to do that, I started screaming that something was wrong with my heart. And then I immediately went into cardiopulmonary arrest. So my heart stopped. They called a code blue, and everyone kind of came rushing, of course, into the room. Code blues don't get called, thankfully, on L&D very often. And so they started CPR, and they got me from my room into the OR quite quickly. My son was born within 6 minutes of the code blue, which without a doubt saved his life. And so he was taken off to the NICU, and CPR was continued throughout the entire C-section. When he was delivered, about 10 minutes in full, they were able to resuscitate me. And at this point, my doctor had realized I was probably having an amniotic fluid embolism. There's not a whole lot of differential diagnoses for a healthy pregnant woman going immediately into cardiopulmonary arrest like that. So there's a second phase of AFE after respiratory distress and often that cardiac arrest that is called DIC. And very quickly, it's simply kind of simplistically described as when your body starts to make all of these little microclots all over, it consumes all of your clotting factors, and then you bleed out excessively. So you hemorrhage excessively. It's really difficult to stop. It's really difficult to manage. It's sort of anecdotally referred to in the anesthesiologist community as death is coming, because the survival rate is so low once DIC happens. And so my team did everything they could to prepare for that. I did go into DIC. I did have another cardiac arrest due to blood loss. They were able to get me back again. They called for ECMO, which is the highest form of life support, from another hospital. ECMO came over with the ECMO team. They were able to get me on ECMO about 2 hours after the initial event. And again, I continued to bleed. And so they were kind of out of options. They had tried uterine artery embolization. They had tried everything that they could. So they had to do a hysterectomy. So they did a hysterectomy. They also removed one of my ovaries, and they packed my abdomen and left it open because they knew they were going to have to go back in. And this all probably it started around noon and it ended around 9 p.m. that night. And so at that time, I had probably had over 120 units of blood product. Eventually, I needed over 140. And they transferred me to the medical center that had sent over ECMO. And when I was transferred, I wasn't really out of the woods as we had hoped. My heart wasn't restarting. So ECMO was keeping me alive, keeping me oxygenated, perfused, all of that good stuff. But my heart wasn't recovering. And so they were kind of out of options where it came to medication. So they had one last try, which was an Impella device, which is, they describe it as basically like this little windmill that they put in through your femoral artery up into your heart to offload your heart and give it time to recover so that hopefully it comes back and works the way it's supposed to. And so that was their last ditch effort. They said, if that didn't work, my heart would clot and unfortunately I wouldn't survive. So that worked, thankfully, in about 12 hours. So I was off ECMO within 2 to 3 days. I was extubated after 4 days. I met my son finally on the 5th day in the ICU. And prior to that, my CT ICU nurses were incredible. And from the time that my son was transferred, which was like 24 hours after me, they had him on skin to skin while I was on ECMO every day, leading up to the time that I was extubated and pulled out of sedation on day 5. And so then I spent a total of 2 weeks in the ICU, and I was actually transferred right to home from the ICU. There was supposed to be kind of a progression where I was going to be in the hospital for a couple of months and then go to rehab, but I did very well. And so again, kind of just like luck, being young, a lot of things in my favor.
Right.
So I was able to be transferred home after 14 days in the ICU.
Okay, there's so much there. It's really
I know.
remarkable, as a therapist and also as a woman, and keep hearing people's stories, like hearing you tell that story almost like in one breath, right? It's
Mm-hmm.
like, I know you've told that story probably many times, but even as I hear you tell that story, there are so many facets of it where my mind is kind of going in so many different directions about wow and unbelievable and how sad and how difficult and oh my gosh, and that's great. And you are the one this is your story. Like this is your lived experience. And I just want to really respect that it's not just a story, right? It's an
Yeah.
actual person who lived through something extraordinary with very significant implications in the long run. I just want to clarify for any of my listeners, when you said specifically that they brought the baby in for skin to skin, even though you were fully sedated, there's an acknowledgement that putting that baby on your chest can actually, obviously, it helps the baby. We usually talk about that, but what you're also saying is that it does also potentially help the mom.
Mm-hmm.
That we've seen situations where they put the baby on the mother and the mother's vitals stabilize, and I think that's so remarkable. Um, so you met your son on what day?
5, day
Day
5.
5. And so,
Yeah.
at what point did you come out of your sedation to know? Like, when do you start having memory of what happened next?
Yeah, probably. I start getting spotty memories back around like day 6,
Hmm.
day 6 or 7. So I don't remember meeting my son. Thankfully, my family did a very good job taking pictures and videos and all of that. But yeah, so day 6, my first memory is of my OB and my anesthesiologist who were there during my AFE at the other hospital, actually came to the medical center that I was at. And they were coming to visit, and my family was still trying to figure out like how to tell me what happened, and they
Sure.
were putting me off for like 24 hours. They kept telling I'm kind of smiling because they kept telling me that I had a C-section with complications, and I was like looking around the CTICU and I was like that feels like more than some complications. Like I don't know what you guys are talking about, but I'm confused. And so my OB and anesthesiologist offered to sit down and tell me what happened instead of my family having to do it, which they very much appreciated. And I did too, because my OB was able to kind of very empathetically tell me, but also tell me directly and not really. I'm a big information gatherer. And so that was really helpful right from the get-go. I remember that conversation
Wow.
explicitly.
And it was at that time that they told you about the hysterectomy as well?
They did.
Everything all at
Yes.
one time.
They did.
Hmm.
Yes. They
Hmm.
told me, yep, from start to finish. I remember her telling me how many units of blood I needed. And I was like, is that a lot? Like, I don't have like I don't have a
Right.
metric here. I've never heard of transfusion. Like, I don't know any of this.
Sure.
And then, yes, I remember specifically in that conversation, I remember being very tired. And I remember being so worried that she would stop talking if I closed my eyes.
Oh,
And so I
wow.
remember saying, please, I need to close my eyes because they hurt, but I need you to keep telling me exactly what happened.
Wow.
And at one point she said, I am so sorry. Like, we tried everything that we could, but we couldn't save your life without doing the hysterectomy. And I just
Yeah.
remember, like, and I get teary talking about that part. It always
Sure.
chokes me up. And I just remember like having like a tear just like kind of come down my face, and that part being very impactful and hard, but I'm also very grateful that they told me right away so that it
Mhm.
wasn't this thing that came on later down the line because everyone was scared that I would have big emotions about it.
Mhm, mhm. I'm thinking about the value of imagining. I wonder who taught that doctor how to have the conversation, right? Like I think about that
Mm-hmm.
as how many times I hear people doing it really poorly, and then
Oh,
how many
yes.
times people can actually get it right. And it sounds to me like your providers understood not only the value of the real conversation, but also how to have that conversation with you, and just
Yes.
acknowledging how sometimes so many people get that completely wrong.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I'd love to hear more about that dichotomy between that split between I'm so grateful, I'm alive, my child is alive, and this really, really horrible permanent thing happened to me. Talk to me a little bit about what that dance is like in your brain and in your
Yeah.
heart.
Yeah, I think at first, like in the hospital, I really did only feel grateful, probably because there really wasn't any room for anything else.
Mm,
I felt grateful. I also felt terrified. I was very like highly anxious, just medically. I had a couple more like random things happen that were pretty traumatic. Like I had like a heart thing that was benign, but people came running in the room and put AED pads on me. And that was like, I need to get out of here.
yeah.
So I had a lot of medical anxiety and like couldn't sleep because if I closed my eyes, I was afraid I was going to die. But overall just felt really, I remember like my wedding song came on because I was always listening to music to try to like, lots of beeping in the ICU, try to drown that out. And my wedding song came on and I remember like hysterically crying, but out of like gratitude that like I still get to be here. Um, and so that kind of all happened in the hospital. And then again, I had parades of people being like, oh my God, like the best meaning. And I'm glad they did because it made me recognize how serious what happened to me was and it validated my feelings. But like people coming in one after another being like, I can't believe you're sitting up and texting right now. Like, I
Mm,
can't believe you're alive. It's like looking at a ghost. And so I got home and that was the goal, right? And this reminds me of NICU parents too. Like the goal is to get home with your baby. And that's where I am. And why do I feel so awful?
yeah.
And
Yeah.
that's when that really hit me. And I remember again, I was discharged after 14 days. So I was medically fragile still.
Oh, yeah.
I was, sleeping 16 hours a day, not having any care over my child at all. My newborn also, it complicated a little bit. He was born at 11 pounds, 10, 14. So I actually couldn't hold him at all
Mm,
because I wasn't allowed to lift anything over 10 pounds. And it was just, obviously I had 4 more abdominal surgeries. So very, again, just medically fragile. And I would sit on that living room couch. I would still the couch that we have in this one spot. And I just wouldn't move. I couldn't move. And that became like the spot. And I would just think and think and think,
mm,
how did this happen to me? Why is this my life? I made a mistake. I never should have had a baby. And of course, that crushes me now, knowing how I feel about my son. But that is how I felt at the time because my world had been turned completely upside down. And
mhm.
as I'm having these thoughts, my brain is going, how dare you? Because a month after I had my AFE, another mom, same exact age as me, in the same exact way, had an AFE at 10 centimeters and died.
Oh,
And so how am I going to sit here and have any other feelings except for gratitude? And that crushed my ability to heal for many months. That was
How did
really hard.
how did you shift? How did you allow yourself? What happened or who happened or what process was that like for you to be willing or able to shift from just one, just that conflict into kind of being able to do multiple feelings at the same time?
Definitely therapy. Definitely my therapist being able to hold that space for me. Because again, these are things I intellectually know as a therapist and
Sure.
yet was unable to apply them to the context of my own life,
Hmm.
which we see so often. When
Sure.
you're in it, it becomes very difficult. And so definitely therapy. I think finding some self-compassion, um, recognizing that I don't have to always be one feeling, that there, again, we can feel two conflicting feelings at the same time. And also that something had to change.
Mm.
There had to be something, because this wasn't working. The way that I was navigating life was not working. And the people who would suffer would of course be me, but would also be my son. And I knew that I had to figure it out. And I definitely experienced postpartum depression alongside the trauma, and medication was incredibly helpful for me alongside therapy with that. I called my OB crying in October, which would have been like 2 months after I was released. Like, nope, this is not working. I need more. I need relief. This is awful. I cry every day. Help.
Yeah. Yeah.
And she was great about that. So that in conjunction with therapy and really just choosing to give myself a break and realize, I think one of the big things is realizing that my experience was not the same as my medical providers.
Mm.
My medical providers, and this is what I talk a lot when I talk about supporting after a maternal near miss, is my providers saw a code that shouldn't have survived, and they saw it through for 9 hours, and that entire hospital worked their butts off to save our lives. And at many points during that, they were like, this person is going to die, and this is going to be the worst day of our career.
Mm.
And then I didn't. And it was the best thing that ever happened.
Wow. Yeah.
But I walked into the hospital to have a baby, and I left without a uterus with a whole bunch of trauma. And all I wanted to do was have a baby and go home. And that is a much different experience. And I
Mm.
had to figure out how to be able to understand the difference in those experiences and be able to honor both of them.
That's so profound. That's such a profound perspective to be able to split. And I also ask you, where did your spouse come into this? Right? Because he was in the room with you. Were there other loved ones in the room with you as well? Other family?
Yeah, so I can tell a piece of this side of the story. I say a piece because I could go on for days about
Sure.
their perspective. But yes, so it was really unfortunate timing in that I was 10 centimeters, so I'm really close with my family and my best friend, and so everyone was coming to the hospital
Mm.
to meet the baby that they assumed would be coming within the hour or two or three, however long it takes to push out a baby. I know that's wide ranging. And with the 11 pounder, it would have been
I
quite a
must
while.
say. Yes.
So my husband was in the room. And so what happened was I said something was wrong. He trusted that. And he actually ran to the hallway and shouted for a doctor.
Mm.
And my parents were in the waiting room because my mom actually was in the room with us. And at that point, my husband, and I don't remember this, but we had agreed. I'm very close with my mom, but I was trying to make it like a just me and my husband thing.
Sure. Sure.
And it was 2 days of me in extreme pain. And I was having trouble coping. And so he was having trouble coping. And he was like, can you please be in the room when she has the baby? We would love to have you. So my mom actually left to go to the waiting room to tell my dad, hey, I'm going to be in for the delivery. And so they heard what they thought was, and my mom said, that sounded like Steve's voice. And my dad was like, no, I don't think it was Steve's voice. They called a rapid, first, and it goes overhead, and it was for room 230, and my parents were the same thing happened. My mom was like, "That's Kayleigh's room." My dad's like, "We don't know what that means." And then it, like 10 seconds after, they called a code blue for my room. And where the waiting room is where all of the people come running from. So my parents saw everyone run. My mom tried to get back to my room, and they were like, "You cannot go back." And she was like, "You don't understand, it's my daughter."
Hmm.
And they were like, "You can't come back." And so then my poor husband was by himself. So he remembers them calling out, like, "We need to go to the OR. OR1's booked, OR2. Do we have a pulse?" And thankfully, he does not remember the response to that for obvious reasons. And so then he was just like, there was a big flurry, and then like he was alone in the room.
Right.
Thankfully, I think a nurse manager had come to talk to him.
Mhm.
My mom came back, but again, then my brother was supposed to be showing up. So my dad waited in the waiting room for my brother.
Mm.
My best friend shows up expecting to see the baby, and she finds a waiting room with my dad crying in the corner next to someone she doesn't know, which was the chaplain.
Oh, wow.
And so my dad has to say, like, "We don't know what's wrong, but it's really bad." And then he goes back, and then my best friend, my brother, shows up happy with his wife, expecting to meet the
Sure.
baby. My best friend is crying in the corner, and now she has to tell my brother that they don't know what's wrong, but it's bad.
Mm. You listen to all that, like the vicarious trauma, the exposure to the
Yes.
trauma. And it's
Yes.
not just vicarious, it's an actual exposure to a significant traumatic event that each of them probably hold their own memories to and their own
Oh,
feelings
yes.
and their own traumatic post-traumatic experiences. Yeah.
Oh, absolutely. I've had them write their perspectives. They've very nicely, most of them have obliged, as they're able to.
Mhm.
But yeah, there are lots of little traumas, unfortunately, that happened along the way. They called
Mhm.
the first time they told my family what happened. They called my husband down to somewhere to be like, I think so that they could be close to the OR, so the doctor could pop in and pop back out.
Sure.
And he remembers like walking down all these long hallways, and they were pretty sure that they were taking him, because he had the chaplain and the social worker on either side of him, to tell him that I had died.
Sure.
And so they took him into a room. My doctor came in covered in blood, which is not her fault. She was saving my life. And basically just said she had an amniotic fluid embolism. The baby is okay, but we're doing everything we can to try to save her life.
Right. Right. I think about how many times everyone forgets to talk to the people that are in the waiting room and in the room with you and watching that experience happen and how complex that is for those that are standing and waiting with no information. Obviously, not the responsibility of the person in the bed, but the responsibility of the caregivers around them. I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about how you began to maneuver or manage your relationship with your son. First of all, what's his name?
Callahan.
Callahan. So
Yeah, we
tell
call him
us a
Cal.
little, Cal, can you talk to me about what that transition was like from being a very, very sick, physically sick person, and then also struggling with the emotional component, and then that response, like kind of beginning to eventually resume some level of responsibility at home, but with so much conflict going on. Talk to me about what that was like to re engage or to begin to engage with your son.
It was, yeah, it was really, really difficult. I remember even in the hospital, it's really difficult to articulate, and I can even barely remember exactly what it feels like, but there's a bone tired that can only be described by being on ECMO and having your blood transfused 10 times over. Like, I
Sure.
will never, ever hopefully feel that tired ever again.
Right.
And there was this feeling of needing to show that, like to make everyone else happy. Like, "Oh, Kayleigh, feed
Mhm.
the baby." "Oh yeah, of course I want to feed the baby." And the entire time in my brain, I was like, "I am so tired. I don't want to do this. This is the worst. I can't stand this. This is awful." And everyone just kept wanting to show me, like they wanted me to take care of my baby, and they wanted everything to be normal. And the same thing happened when I went home. My parents had to live with us for 6 weeks. And that created a whole nother, they're the best. We love them dearly. But at the time, everyone was traumatized.
Sure.
And we are swimming in trauma soup. And my husband was like, "We were supposed to be a family of three. Now we're a family plus your parents. Like, this is awful." And so I would sit there on that couch and everyone else would take care of my baby. And I remember my husband turning to me and being like, do you want to feed him? And me just like flipping out finally. And him being like,
What did I
I
do?
just wanted to, I'm like, everyone wants me to do all this stuff. I'm so tired. I'm recovering. Like, no one is, all of this stuff comes out. But in terms of me bonding with Cal, it took probably about 6 months from when he was born. And I really wish someone would have normalized that for me. I really wish someone would have normalized that for my family, because my
Right.
mom was terrified. She thought I would never bond. Like, I would come down the stairs in the morning. They had all been taking care of him. And she remembers like he would be on the dressing table that we had doctored up in the family room. And I would just like walk right by and not say anything, not care to do anything. And what she didn't understand is it wasn't like I was like actively like, oh, there's my baby and I don't want to see him. It was like, this is the worst thing that's ever happened to me. My like flashback, just trying to like survive. And so, yes, I would say it took about 6 months, and had someone normalize that for me, I think I would have had a lot less anxiety about it. Because I was worried that I was the worst mom in the world and that I would never bond with him, and that he deserved a better mom. And it wasn't until my husband went back to work, and that was terrible in itself. But then I slowly, over those 3 or 4 months, would like take him out with me to like Target or somewhere, or like to go to lunch with a friend. I started having like my own experiences with him. But there's a level of devastation that it's really difficult to describe when you have to be told about how to care for your child and what your child likes by someone else when you're his mom.
I think about that even for people who don't have this history of trauma, but have had this history of significant postpartum psychosis or depression. And like, there's this absence that's necessary, but then coming back, how devastating that must be. How devastating that must be. I'm noticing our time. I feel like I could talk to you for at least another 2 hours, but I want to make sure that we can touch on a few things. One is we haven't talked at all about what it means to live in the aftermath of an emergency hysterectomy. You use that term, a near miss, and I just want for anybody who is not familiar with it, it's a term when a woman almost dies at birth, and it's a near miss. It's a maternal near miss, or a potential would have been a fatality, and she didn't. And there is a cohort of support that's available on Facebook for survivors of the near miss, and I encourage anybody who has experienced that to make sure that they are connected with others, because it is such a unique experience. So in the aftermath of surviving and also finding out that you had to have a hysterectomy, the story continues. It's not like it's a finite and now I'm good. Can you talk as much as you'd like to about that reality?
Yeah, that's one of the hardest pieces, right? Because I don't know, like for me at least, at a certain point, surviving the AFE became like the heroic, like we did the thing. We survived the thing we weren't supposed to survive. Like, look how cool is a little bit rough of a word, but like kind of cool given the fact that this had to happen. The outcome was really great on the surface. And so that story feels okay. The part where I can't have any more children is harder, and that took me a while to even really touch. I call it kind of like the white hot grief that I wasn't willing to approach for a while, to the point where at 8 months postpartum, I was like in the reproductive endocrinologist's office talking about surrogacy, talking about freezing embryos. Like, my husband wanted nothing to do with that for a lot of very valid reasons. And I was like steamrolling my way through because it was the only way that I could deal with what had happened. And so that created a lot of conflict in our marriage as well. But that was how I dealt with it at first. And then when I had to deal with it, eventually, when we decided sort of that we weren't going to have any more children, and I say sort of because, I'm always like, well, my brain is always like, there could be a 7-year gap and that'd be okay. There could be a 9-year gap and that, right? Even though they're like, it's at about a 1% chance at this point that we would ever go through with surrogacy for, again, a lot of different reasons. That was harder. having to actually face the grief of that choice being taken away. And I did never have a good answer, because there is no good answer, because it just sucks and it will continue to suck. And I also have these really beautiful, amazing moments with the kiddo that I do have that sit next to that grief. Doesn't mean it doesn't exist. It doesn't erase that grief. Just as my love for Cal doesn't get erased because I desire another child, or at least a choice to have another child. They just kind of sit next to each other. And there are a lot of wonderful supports out there for people who either by choice or by circumstance have only children. And those sites, once I was able to get to a point of healing where I felt a little more comfortable and could like crack open the door, I was able to view some positives of having an only child and lean into that part a little bit more, which I do think has helped with healing, but has definitely taken a little bit to be able to see those parts of the journey, for sure.
I think about like within the religious Jewish community and the struggle where the families are typically large. And very often when women go through a very complex birth, and sometimes it could be a birth trauma, sometimes it could end with a hysterectomy, there could be a lot of secrecy around it, a lot of not telling. We know she was very sick and then we don't talk about it. And I understand the concept of privacy, but it also lends itself to this whole vulnerability of nobody really knows what happened. And then there's this, like, as time passes, what I hear from the women I work with is like, I should be pregnant again by now. I'm 2 years out. I'm 3 years out, and feeling the finality as others begin to continue to have those babies, in kind of rapid succession, and then being not having access to that story, but yet nobody knowing why you can't have more, and the conflict in that. It's a good moment to acknowledge that there's actually a support group within the Knafayim organization, a religious group of women for women who have had hysterectomies, typically emergency, where they can meet with other women who have gone through that as well. So I think that what you've highlighted, there's so many pieces of this that are very profound, very meaningful. I love that visual of standing next to, standing beside. I like using the word like pulling up a seat at the table. Like that grief is here to hang out with us for a long time. But as we wrap it up today, I'm wondering if you could tell me a little bit about maybe one or two. What are the top misconceptions that you wish people understood about birth trauma or about the lived experience after birth trauma?
Oh, just two.
Okay,
Okay.
fine. You can go for five,
No,
whatever
it's
you
fine.
like.
No, it's fine.
I didn't want to put too much pressure.
No, I appreciate too. I just have to really think about it. I would say that one of the biggest ones is that people think that it's a choice to be impacted by it. This idea of don't dwell on it. You're making it worse. Just forget about it. Just ignore it. At least the baby's healthy. At least you're healthy. All of the pleasantries or platitudes in the world. And it's not a choice to dwell, quote unquote, on a traumatic experience. We know this from the neurobiology of trauma, which I'm sure you will get into on other episodes. But I think,
For sure.
I think that piece, and for people who are going through it, you're not choosing to dwell on it. It's actually your brain trying to reprocess and heal, and it's struggling to because you need support. And so that's definitely one big misconception. The other thing I want people who have survived a birth trauma to understand is that you can love your baby to the ends of the earth, like so much. We love our children so much, it is painful. And you can do that, and you can still hate the day that they were born. That day is not your relationship with your child. And it says nothing about how much you love your child. It is just an experience of that day. And other trauma survivors in other events, car accidents, things like that, get to just hate that day to the ends of the earth. And we have the unfortunate situation of that day being tied to the day that the best part of us came into this world. And it's okay to hate that day, not like that day, however you want to label it. It does not say anything about your love or your relationship with your child.
Oh, wow. So much to take in. Really, thank you. Thank you. I feel like there's going to have to be a part two because there's so many pieces that I'm like, wait, I want you to talk about that also. But I do just want to acknowledge that I know that it also is difficult for you. I have to imagine that it takes energy to sit with me and to tell your story and to go there. Even though a therapist, even having done the work, there's still a heaviness in this story. And so I just want to acknowledge that with appreciation that you're willing to do this to help another, select group of people who and potentially their spouses and family members who will not have otherwise heard your story. And I know that especially these messages that you kind of very subtly and very eloquently put in there will impact the way that other women experience not only their own difficulties, but also how they will experience when a family member goes through something very difficult and very and traumatic. So thank you for being willing to do that with me today. I am incredibly grateful, as are my listeners.
Oh, thank you so much for those kind words, and thank you for having me. This is such a lovely way to connect with you and with your community. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.